neighbors and friends. Typically, the play is organized through the Kentucky history class, but this year it was organized through the English class, and Mrs. Hamill has been the one who has put it together, is directing it, and has done all the work. So I wanted to express my gratitude and a special appreciation to her for taking over the last 3 or 4 weeks. So thank you very much.
I'd ask them to give a longer So these kids have been working on these characters for about 8 weeks now. They've written amazing research reports on each of them. There are 10 students in the 7th grade this year, and each of these students is a wonderful writer. I've never seen a stronger writing class ever in my 18 years at Marcel. So I'm super proud of these students, and I keep telling them that I want all their autographs because I think some of them are going to be famous one day. How well they write. So we were talking about it. We think this is probably the 15th annual Marcel Kentucky History Play. So welcome and enjoy the show.
Good morning, families. Isn't Stephen Foster's song just lovely? He wrote My Old Kentucky Home in 1853, just 10 years before I was born. Most of you know that the song talks about the loss of home and was sung by thousands of soldiers all across the nation during the Civil War. But if you read the lyrics, and we will all sing them together here in a moment, pay special attention, and you can see that Stephen wrote it as an anti-slavery song. Many people in Kentucky were against slavery. In fact, in my book, I say that no point about Kentucky's Constitution is more worthy of note than that we prohibited the commerce of slaves and gave power to the body to force the owners of slaves to treat them more humanely. Since I speak with you all every year, I almost forgot to introduce myself. I'm Elizabeth Shelby Kincaid, and I wrote the Kentucky history book that your 7th graders study. A Kentuckian from my infancy, I've been imbued with a knowledge and love of the state. In my book, I give a special effort to portraying the spirit of the Kentuckian, and so I give more space to the characters and their stories than most historians. You're going to meet several of these characters today. Our history is at once unique and attractive. It begins like a romance, thrilling in tales of heroic deeds and exciting adventures. None but the brave dared or desired to risk the perils of these untried forests. Therefore, Kentucky was founded by men of forceful qualities, remarkable as well for strength of mind as for endurance of body. Today we have the special honor of meeting not just one, but 2 of our most famous frontiersmen.
Greetings. I would tell you my name, but I have a liking to see if I'm still famous around here. Just holler it out when you guess. Here are the names: the Great Frontiersman, the Great White Wolf, Cuttahatha, the Scout of the Frontier, and the man whose gun is never empty. Yes, I'd come to say that I am Simon Kenton, the man that even Shawnees fear for his ability to run and reload his faithful gun at the same time. I was born in y'all's modern-day Virginia. I wasn't the most productive growing up. In fact, I was downright lazy. I didn't do a lick of work unless I was just coming off of a whipping, which was fairly often. I always picked fights as well. 2 of my most famous fights were over a girl. After the first one, I came stumbling home in tatters, but in the second one, I killed my rival, William Leachman. The woman was Ellen Cummins. I wanted to marry her, but I was completely tongue-tied around her, and that eventually led to William Leachman getting to her first. After fleeing Kentucky for killing Leachman, I became a frontier scout. I scouted for multiple forts and during multiple wars. In one of my more well-known wars, Lord Dunmore's, I saved Daniel Boone from Indians, using my technique of running and reloading, of course. I evaded the Shawnees many times, but eventually my luck ran out and I was captured. Multiple times during my captivity, I was tortured. In fact, I had to sleep on a stretching rack most nights. Not fun. I also had to run this thing called a gauntlet 9 times. The gauntlet was like an Indian state fair. The Indians gathered in 2 quarter-mile straight lines and beat the tar out of white men for fun. I had a hole hammered in my skull and numerous other broken bones. Any of y'all want to try some of that torture? That's what I thought. Most sane people wouldn't, but I was strong enough to endure. I eventually gathered the courage to venture back home. There, I found my father in ill condition. I did what I could to help him, which wasn't much. Then, much to my surprise, William and Ellen Leachman came in the door. I hadn't killed him after all. He stared at me for a moment with a dumbfounded look on his face and welcomed me back with open arms. I was overjoyed that he didn't hate me. I became a Christian later in my life, too. I vowed to lay down my gun and never pick it back up again. I ran a small shop to keep things going, but I remained a traveler nevertheless. I was getting older and weaker, and I knew my days were coming to an end. I died peacefully, laying in a bed and not fighting Indians in 1836. I took my last breath at 81 years old. Well, if it isn't Daniel Boone himself. Howdy, friend. Great. I was just talking to these mighty fine people about you. You want to take the rest of your story?
Well, if you already shared the part about you saving me from the Indians, then I'd be happy to share the rest.
Floor's all yours.
Howdy, y'all. My name is Daniel Boone. Now, y'all might know me as the guy that gone down into Kentucky and did some exploring, but if that's all you think I did, then you haven't seen nothing. Now, up there in Reading, Pennsylvania, where I was born, my daddy made me take care of the farm. Now, I hated this job because you couldn't go nowhere until all the work was did. But the best part of working the farm was when it rained, because then I could go out into the woods and hunt. Now, I tell you that I was far better at shooting than any other man. No one, and I mean no one, could have beaten me at a shooting contest. When I was a little older, I fought in the French and Indian War. There I met this man named John Filson. He actually ended up writing a book about me, but besides the point, he told me about this beautiful land called Kentucky, where there was a ginormous amount of buffalo and turkey. We decided to go there after the war, and it was just as Filson described. But it was not an easy journey. Indians was capturing us like crazy, and in the end, only me, my brother, and Filson were left. When we returned home, a man named Richard Henderson asked me to blaze a trail through the Cumberland Gap. This was a year of strenuous work, but it paid off. We called this road through the Wilderness Road. I then took my wife and daughter into Kentucky, and they was the first white women to stand on the banks of the Kentucky River. I also built Fort Boonesborough down there. Now, once I was captured by Indians, and they adopted me as one of their own because I was a valuable captive. But while I was in captivity, I heard of a plan to attack my fort. So I escaped and ran all the way back and warned them, and we were able to beat the Indians. Soon, the English moved into Kentucky, and their government, seeing all the good things I had done, took away my land. So I moved across the Mississippi into modern-day Missouri, and there lived out the rest of my days.
Congress of the United States had agreed to admit Kentucky into the Union as an independent state, June 1st, 1792. Representatives from all 9 original counties created our Constitution, and they elected Isaac Shelby, who took part in our struggle to break away from Virginia, as our first governor. There has not been a more beloved governor since Governor Shelby. We loved him so much that we forced him out of retirement to become our 5th governor as well.
Thank you, Mrs. Kincaid, for that mighty fine introduction. Friends, I'm a soldier. I fought in the Revolutionary War, many battles I'd like to forget. When the citizens of Kentucky elected me as their first governor, I did not care for the position, but this state needed me. In my first address to the Senate, I called for several laws that would make this a stronger government and kinder to our slaves. I ended my speech by asking for a permanent seal for the Commonwealth. Eventually, our seal became two young Kentuckians embracing one another. One is to be said Daniel Boone, who you just talked to, and the other, myself. I'll let that mystery stand for today. I was happy to leave politics at the end of my term, but the Kentuckians demanded me back in 1812. They needed my battle experience for the War of 1812. When the president called for troops, we sent double the amount of men, and I led them to battle. I'll let you read what the U.S. Journal said about us Kentuckians. I'm personally too embarrassed to repeat it myself. But I will brag on my son-in-law, Ephraim McDowell, who married my daughter, Sarah. That young man was one of the finest surgeons in all of America.
Daddy, did I hear you talking about Ephraim again?
I can't help it, sweetie. Do you want to do the honors? I'm rather behind on my work for the American Bible Society.
Sure thing. I'm so glad you started that group. Like Daddy said, Ephraim McDowell was a very famous surgeon who is best remembered for his Christmas Day surgery. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was a few days before Christmas when Ephraim, the kids, and I were sitting at the dinner table when there was a knock at the door. He was needed at the Crawford home, 60 miles away, where Jane Todd Crawford was having complications during birth of twins. The two doctors with Jane could not get her to deliver. So Ephraim rode horseback through the snow and arrived at the Crawfords around midnight. When he got there, he realized that she was not pregnant with twins. She wasn't pregnant at all. Mrs. Crawford had a 22-pound ovarian tumor. An ovarian tumor had never successfully been removed before, and even the best surgeon in the world thought it impossible. And remember, there was no anesthesia in 1809, but Mrs. Crawford believed in my husband's ability. So he brought her back to Danville with him, where he performed the operation on Christmas Day. Before the operation, he wrote out a prayer and put it in his pocket, then offered Mrs. Crawford some whiskey, but she refused to drink. Instead, she sang hymns and recited Bible verses during the 25-minute surgery. Not only did Mrs. Crawford survive, she was up and making her bed within 5 days, fully recovered within 25. She lived 32 more years after that. When writing about the surgery several years later and face of disbelief by others, Ephraim wrote, "I can only say that the blessing of God has rested on my efforts." God blessed Ephraim with many more successful surgeries, including one for James K. Polk. Sadly, Ephraim left this world far too early. He was not yet 60 when he died from what doctors said was appendicitis. But let's not dwell on that sad story.
Next, we want you to meet one of our most famous Kentuckians. Henry Clay is one of the greatest speakers in American history, but things didn't start out that way. He was born in 1777 in Virginia, the seventh of 9 children. He didn't have a formal education as a child, and that is something he always regretted. His house was ransacked by the British when he was 3, and his father died when he was only 4 years old. I'll let him tell you the story of his rise from shopkeeper's assistant.
Growing up, I would go downtown and listen to the great public speakers, and I would practice speaking just like them. Then I worked as a shopkeeper's assistant. I worked hard and people noticed. Soon I was hired by a lawyer to be a law clerk. One day, Judge George Wythe came in and noticed me. He was old and had a shaky hand, so he hired me to be his scribe. He took me into his home and became my mentor. Under his wing, I became a lawyer. They did not need many lawyers in Virginia, so I moved to Kentucky, where I married my wife, Lakeisha. We were happy together, and she always did do a good job running our Lexington home when I was away in Washington, but we had some hard times. All 6 of our daughters died young. That broke my heart. One of my sons also died as a young man. Then, 2 more of my sons also died fighting on opposite sides of the Civil War, which I tried so hard to prevent. My political career began when I was elected to the U.S. Senate. Then I moved to the House of Representatives. Then I moved to the Speaker of the House. As Speaker of the House, I supported the War of 1812 against Great Britain. From 1825 to 1829, I served as Secretary of State under President John Adams. As I mentioned, I did run for president 3 times, but I did not get elected. I was not too upset over losing the presidency because, as I once said, I'd rather be right than president. I wanted the U.S. to gradually free their slaves without going to war over it. I freed my own slaves in my will. I died in 1852 in tuberculosis. My funeral procession was one of the biggest in history. My body was laid to rest in Lexington Cemetery, and people can still go there and visit me today.
Now we're going to hear from another great speaker who grew up in Kentucky. He wasn't speaking to people in the halls of Washington, but across the hills of Kentucky.
Hello, brothers and sisters. My name is Peter Cartwright. I wasn't born in Kentucky, but my daddy moved me here at a young age. Daddy fought in the Revolutionary War. Daddy moved us to a rough part of the country in Logan County called Rogues Harbor. It was called Rogues Harbor because all kinds of criminals would hide from the law there. When I was a young boy, I got caught up in all that rowdiness. I drank, gambled with cards, and horse raced. Oh, and I loved to dance. My daddy gave me my first set of cards, and to be honest, I was really good at winning other people's money. My mom was a strong Christian lady. I would often hear her praying for me in our cabin at night. And let me tell you something, God heard those prayers. One night when I was 16, me and my dad attended a wedding. We had a grand time. We drank and danced, but when I got home, I was convicted about how I spent my time that night. My heart was racing. I felt faint. I thought I was dying. My mom prayed all that night for me and with me. That night, I told God if he spared me, I would serve him. The next few days were tough. I spent almost all my time praying for God's mercy. Then one night at a revival meeting, I heard God say to me, "Thy sins are all forgiven thee." Though I have in many ways been unfaithful, I have never once doubted then and there that God forgave my sins. About a month later, I joined the Methodist Church, and I never regretted that decision. I started leading Bible studies and telling people about God. In 1802, Methodist gave me permission to be a preacher. I loved it even though I was young. Folks there called me the boy preacher, but they all wanted to hear me preach. Eventually, they made me a deacon, and Francis Asbury himself made me an elder. During my time as a frontier circuit rider, God allowed me to convert over 10,000 people and preach over 15,000 sermons along Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. But the life of a frontier circuit rider ain't easy. I rarely had money. Isaac Shelby's brother, General Moses Shelby, let me borrow money one time. I often fought rowdies in our camp meetings. One time I jumped a fence to deal with a rowdy. I fell off and hurt my ribs. I grabbed him and he thought I had a knife and ran away. God always looked after me. I loved Kentucky, but one thing I couldn't stand was slavery. The older I got, the more and more I hated it. And Kentucky seemed to support it more and more. So, in 1824, I moved my family to Illinois. When I got there, I heard that some folks there were trying to make Illinois a slave state. I couldn't take that, so I ran for Illinois State Congress. And you know what? I won. Twice. I even ran against someone you might have heard of before, Abraham Lincoln. But thankfully, he beat me. I lived an amazing life, from sinful horse racing to eternal glory because of God's grace. You could say I went from hoofbeats to heaven.
"10 years after Henry Clay passed his compromises to keep the nation from war, nobody was listening to reason. By 1860, the North and the South were at odds, and war seemed inevitable. Kentuckians kept their cool, and even though a majority of Kentuckians felt the federal government was getting too strong, they shuddered at the thought of civil war and voted to stay neutral in the conflict. Had the other states followed Kentucky's example of forbearance, there could have been no war. Perhaps war was necessary. Perhaps it was the only means by which the abolition of slavery could be accomplished. Of course, it was impossible for Kentucky to make peace, and equally impossible for her to remain apart from combat. So our boys ended up on opposing sides, neighbor against neighbor and brother against brother, a house divided. It is a curious coincidence that the two men who took the political lead in the great conflict of the nation were born in Kentucky within 1 year of each other. We will now hear from the leader of the North and two great leaders from the South.
So, you want to learn about Abraham Lincoln, do you? Well, fine then. I was born in Kentucky in 1809, and I was assassinated in 1865. Nah, I'm just messing with you. How about this? If I had a nickel for each one of my names, I'd have two, because I never had three. I mean had, not hat. There's nothing in my hat.
And it went straight through your hat.
Sorry about that. Did I ever tell you about the time I was kicked in the head by a horse when I was young? They thought I was dead for several days. Well, now that that's over, we should get down to brass tacks. Speaking of which, did you know I was the first president to be on a U.S. coin? I was also the first president to have a beard while in office, thanks to Grace Bedell. I'm pretty sure she was the reason I won the presidency. And if I had not become president, I would have never been able to make Thanksgiving a holiday. That's right. The break from work you get on Thanksgiving, you have me to thank. But no one does. Being president is hard work. Sometimes I suffer from mild depression. I like to tell jokes and amusing stories to ease the stress that comes from being in office. Once, while I was splitting rails working on a fence, a man walked up to me with a rifle in his hand and pointed the rifle at my head and said, "A long time ago, I swore if I ever saw a man uglier than me, I'd shoot him." So I opened up my arms and said, "If I'm uglier than you, I don't want to live." Once, while me and Mary were eating dinner at a dining table, she noticed I was feeding my tabby cat right at the table with the golden fork.
Why are you feeding a cat at our dinner table with a golden fork?
If the golden fork is good enough for Buchanan, it's good enough for Tabby. I didn't much like that Buchanan fella. People seem to think I was the reason that slavery ended and that the Union stayed together. I wish we could have avoided the war altogether. But when the 7 states left the Union, I knew we had to stay and fight. United we stand, divided we fall. Kentucky was an important part of keeping the Union together. I always said, I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. With its extensive railroads and network of river systems, it was an important part of keeping the Union together.
All right, you spent enough time talking about yourself. Now it's my turn. I was born in Lexington, Kentucky. You should see my house. It's simply luxurious. I had a close servant named Mammy Sally, who gave me abundant attention. My mom died when I was only 6. And my father married my awful stepmother, Elizabeth Humphreys. She said I was a limb of satin loping down the broad road leading to destruction. I got my expensive taste from my step-grandmother, whom I loved. You can see my Mervusia dress here and belle roses in my hair. I learned to speak French at a boarding school. Oh, j'aime parler français. After school, I had to keep away from my parents, mostly my stepmother, so I moved in with my sister Elizabeth. There is where I met my husband, Abraham Lincoln, who was then a lawyer and state legislator. We liked each other, but my family strongly rejected Lincoln. I didn't care, so we got married. We had 4 sons, who brought me joy as well as heartache. Since Lincoln was lawyer of who knows what, he had to leave often, and I had to stay home with the kids.
Now, Mary, you know perfectly well that I was a lawyer who practiced common law and helped many people collect debts owed to them.
Will you not interrupt me? Soon, Abe became the president, and the Civil War broke out. My son Willie became ill, and Tad got sick too. Tad recovered, but Willie died. Oh, he was gone. Gone. I would never see him again. Afterwards, I visited slaves, and people were mad because I was visiting slaves instead of soldiers. They were so awful to me.
There, Mary. It wasn't that bad. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go find a new general to help us win this war.
When the war finally ended, my husband had this great idea to go to Ford's Theater to celebrate the end of the war. But it turned out to be a movie choice because John Wilkes Booth shot my husband in the head during the play. Oh, how awful, how grieving, how sudden. I stayed secluded in my room for a month. Finally, they kicked me out because the newly sworn President Johnson had to move in. My son Tad died next. I was I didn't handle it well, to say in the least. My son Robert thought I was insane after that. Do you blame me? So he put me in a private mental institution. Imagine the horror, the embarrassment. When I was released, my health only worsened. So I returned to my sister's house where I died and was buried with my husband and sons.
Friends, I'm happy for a chance to explain myself. I grant that I don't have winsome personality like Abe, but people don't realize that I worked day and night, 12 years to prevent the war, but I could not. The North was mad and blind, would not let us govern ourselves, so the war came. I, Jefferson Davis, born in 1808, Fairview, Kentucky, just a few days walk from here. I attended George Transylvania University when I was 13, then spent 4 years at West Point. Before the Civil War, I was Mexican war hero, congressman, secretary of war, and finally, member of the Senate. However, when things were getting tense between the North and the South, I resigned my position from the Senate with great applause in a packed house. In my final address to the Union, I already had in my mind that secession was a right the Constitution had given us, even if I did not fully agree with it. In my address, I said this: we will be deprived in the Union with the rights which our fathers bequeathed to us. In 1861, I was inaugurated President of the Confederacy. I was one of few men who had both the military and political knowledge capable of running our government. So, I was the right man for the job, even though I did not want it. My experience and my fervor for states' rights helped me to win at Fort Sumter. On April 13, 1861, I ordered Confederate troops to open fire on the fort. 34 hours later, it surrendered. I was known as the President without precedent because I had to shape a brand new nation during a war with no navy, very few manufacturing plants, and almost no railroads to transport supplies. On April 9, 1865, my general, Robert E. Lee, surrendered at the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse. This was the beginning of the end for me because just a month later, I was imprisoned for treason. I spent 2 long, horrible years at Fort Monroe in prison. Finally, on Christmas Day, 1868, the case of treason against me was dropped. I was glad to be released, but my health had been greatly degraded. In an effort to improve health, I traveled to Europe several times. However, this did not help. I spent the rest of my days living at Beauvoir, a plantation in Mississippi, and writing my memoirs.
Hello, all. I'm Brigadier General John Hunt Morgan, and this is my wife, Maddie. I was born in Alabama, but moved to Kentucky and attended Transylvania for a time, until I got kicked out for fighting in a duel. Guess that says a little bit about my fighting nature. I saw combat in the Mexican-American War, but then returned home to Kentucky to be a hemp farmer.
Let's move along to the exciting part. Morgan's name is famous for his legendary raid into Ohio and Indiana in 1863. What many of you may not have heard is that Morgan carried out part of this raid against direct orders. Morgan and his men captured about 6,000 Union soldiers and militia, destroyed 34 bridges, disrupted the railroads, and diverted tens of thousands of troops from other duties. They spread terror and seized thousands of dollars worth of food and supplies.
My troops and I were at the northernmost point reached by Southern soldiers during the war. When we were captured, they took us to the Ohio State Penitentiary and treated us cruelly.
But I knew he would find a way to escape.
One of my captains noticed that the floor in his cell was not damp because there was an airspace underneath. So we stole knives from the prison mess hall and started digging. We were going to connect several cells with the passage, but unfortunately, we did not know how far to dig in order to reach them. So Hines and I tricked a guard into taking out a measuring tool with which we measured our cells and estimated digging distances. On the day of the escape, I climbed out of my bed and made a fake sleeping figure in it out of straw and clothes covered by the blanket. We climbed into the passageway and broke out. We threw a grappling hook that we made up the wall and began to climb over. Once outside, we split up for safety reasons.
Then he came across a Union officer and pretended to be a Union officer himself.
I said, "He has given us a fair share of trouble, and I drink to him. He will not be released. May he ever be as closely kept as he is now." Speaking of trouble, it's time I set off for another raid. They've restricted me to minor operations since I went crazy in Ohio and Indiana, but I can still wreak a little havoc.
I wish you luck, Morgan, and as usual, I won't be able to wait for your return. I have just received news that my husband was shot and killed. On September 4th, 1864, in Greenville, Tennessee, he was shot by one Federal Private Andrew Campbell, a young man who once served under him. The Confederacy has lost one of its bravest men. My husband just loved being in the military. After the Mexican-American War, when there wasn't any fighting to be had in the U.S. Army, he funded and trained a group of militiamen called the Lexington Rifles. They joined the Confederacy in 1862, and we've already told you about their fierce raids. They were so fierce, in fact, that Union children made up a poem about my husband. I'll leave you with this verse of warning often heard in the schoolyards.
I'm sent to warn the neighbors. He isn't a mile behind. He sweeps up all the horses, every horse that he can find. Morgan, Morgan the raider, and Morgan's terrible men, with bowie knives and pistols, are galloping up the glen.
After the war, we pardoned every soldier who fought for the Confederacy and decided that our future greatness would depend largely upon education. I'm glad that the parents and teachers and students at this school take education so seriously. We would like to leave you with a few lines from the poem Kentucky is My Land by Jesse Stewart. He was a Kentucky teacher born in 1907 whose work is celebrated across the nation.
Kentucky is my land. It's the land beneath the wind and the sun. It's the very heart of America. It is bordered on the east, north, and west by rivers, and on the south by mountains. Only one boundary line is not a natural one. It is a portion of southern boundary that runs westward from the mountains across the Delta lowlands toward the Mississippi.
These natural boundaries is Kentucky, shaped like a moldboard on the hillside turning cloud. Kentucky is neither southern, northern, eastern, or western. It is the core of America. If these United States can be called body, Kentucky can be called its heart.
When I go beyond the border, I take with me the growth and the beauty of the seasons, the music of the wind hidden behind the cedar tops, the breathless song of snow-melted water, and the border of the rocks to the winter streams. I take with me Kentucky embedded in my brain and heart.
In my flesh, bone, and blood. For I am of Kentucky, Kentucky.
Will you stand as we sing our anthem along with the Mars Hill String Ensemble?